All right, so hello, I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service here in Hancock County, and I am joined today by my coworker, Miss Jennifer O'Banner, who is our Family and Consumer Science agent here in Hancock County. And today we are going to talk to you about herbs for Mississippi gardens. So I'm going to talk a little bit about growing herbs and arranging herb plantings in the home landscape. Talk about some of the specific herbs that do very well here in the state of Mississippi, and of course the surrounding states as well. For those that might be joining us from other states, and then Miss O'Banner is going to talk about some of the uses for herbs and their preservation. So thank you very much for joining us today. And first of all, we should start off, just kind of clarifying what we mean when we say herbs. Because very often we'll use the term herbaceous plants, and really any soft-stemmed green plant is an herb. But usually, when we're using that term, what we mean are non tropical plants where we're using the leaves or the stems as a flavoring, potentially as a fragrance, and in some cases as a medicine. We distinguish that a little bit from when we're talking about spices. Usually, spices come from a tropical region, not all the time, and we're usually using roots or seeds or bark or fruit in those cases. Though certainly there are some forms of herbs where we are using the seeds and other products like that. A note on pronunciation and just a little bit of history, because occasionally you will run into someone who says herbs as herbs, and both are actually correct. It's perfectly okay however you say it. If we go back in time and look at the etymology of the word or the origin of the word, the oldest form actually is as herb, and that spelling got changed in the 15th century. And you'll find that in the UK and places like Canada or Australia, you will find that a lot of them do pronounce that H. But here in the United States, with a little bit of French influence, we tend to drop that H and just say herb. But however you say it is perfectly fine. Just to grow them and have fun with it. Most herbs are going to do very well in well-drained soil. Like a lot of the plants around our landscape, they are generally going to enjoy soil pHs that are in that range of 6 to about 6.8. Normally for vegetables, we're looking at that, right around that 6.5 range for soil pH. Now, there are some herbs where they do tend to prefer a little bit more of an alkaline soil, particularly rosemary, which is one of the most popular herbs that we grow. And lavender prefer that more alkaline soil, but not too far, just a little bit above 7, around 7.5. And oftentimes, one of the things we're really concerned with is fertilization. And generally, with herbs, we actually want to avoid over fertilizing those plants because we really want them to develop a strong flavor. All of that comes from the oils that are produced by that plant. And high fertilization or having too much water, even being in the shade, can lower down all of the oil accumulation that happens in that plant. So we want to keep our fertilization to a minimum. Make sure we're providing enough water, but certainly not too much. And most of them are going to enjoy growing in the full sun. And there are some exceptions to that we can talk about. Generally, it's a good idea to till that growing area down to about 8 to 12 inches. Most of our herbs are going to be pretty drought tolerant, but we do want to make sure that they're getting enough water. And generally speaking, our annual herbs, plants that we're going to plant from seed every year, are going to require a little bit more water than we see for our perennial herbs. We do again want them to be in what we're going to call full sun, at least 6 hours of sunlight. Up to about 8 hours is going to do really well. Uh, I generally encourage people to plant herbs either in containers or in raised beds. I think they grow a lot better, tend to have really good drainage in that situation, and that warmer soil temperature is going to help their growth. It doesn't mean you certainly can grow them in native soil, but raised beds just work very well as a way to plant them densely, be able to produce a lot of herbs in a relatively small area. It is a good idea to mulch. That's going to help maintain that soil moisture, prevent a little bit of evaporation, and make sure that our watering will stay even. And of course, no one wants to spend all of their time weeding, so having that mulch in there is going to do a good job of helping to discourage those weeds. And generally, I'm going to encourage you to use an organic mulch of some sort. And what I mean by that is a mulch that's going to be made of a formerly living material, something like shredded bark or wood chips or pine straw. All of those materials are going to work really well as mulches in our herb beds. And when we're designing our garden, whether we're talking about a single container or a raised bed, it is always useful to make sure that we're thinking about the requirements of the individual plants and grouping those plants together either in a container, a raised bed, or in the soil, and making sure that we're putting the plants that have the same requirements together. Just makes maintenance of it a whole lot easier. And then you can combine plants to really give you a variety of different textures and leaf colors and flower colors that allows your herb beds to not only provide you with great stuff to use in your kitchen, but also provides you a lot of attractive area out in your landscape. And having that diversity of plants means you're going to have plants flowering at different times, and that really is going to help out with, again, maintaining an attractive area in the landscape. Now, there are all sorts of different herb gardens. We can incorporate them into our landscapes in a wide array of different ways. My favorite thing to do with my herbs, rather than having a dedicated area in my garden for herbs, I integrate all of my herb plants into my flower beds. They're great as an attractive area for butterflies and other desired wildlife to come in and be there. They can look very attractive. Some of the herb species have really nice flowers or really nice foliage, work really well as border plants. So they integrate very well into flower gardens, and they really are a natural addition to butterfly gardens, not only because the flowers can be used by butterflies, but also because those herb plants serve as host plants for a lot of our caterpillars, particularly things like parsley, do fantastic as a food source for the caterpillars. Of course, that does mean you're going to have to plant a little bit extra because you are going to have to share your herbs that you're growing with the caterpillars that are turning into really attractive butterflies later. A lot of sort of the standard in early Americana was homes having a kitchen garden, and that would be vegetables and herbs planted in a rectangular plot right outside the kitchen, so that whoever's in there cooking can step outside the kitchen door and harvest herbs right from the garden. A lot of herbs do very well when they're harvested fresh and used as soon as possible. So having that garden in a really accessible spot really makes that a lot easier. Now, have to mention another classic design of herb gardens, and I saw some really wonderful examples of this the last time I was in Washington, D.C., where they have these really interesting sort of formal knot gardens where they have evergreens planted as borders to kind of increase that green space and provide a little bit of winter interest. But they put in the middle, they put in all of their herb plants, maybe some vegetable plants that in there as well, and really incorporate those herbs into the landscaping of the area. And I think that really is an attractive way to do that. If you have the space for it, you can see something like that down in that bottom picture. So in terms of growing herbs, of course, it is very easy to start herbs from seed. Miss O'Banner and I were doing that just the other day out in the back area of our office. And for the spring season, generally we want to start those seeds in late winter. Here in the very southern part of Mississippi, we can do that in late February. You might need to go a little bit further into the year if you're in a northern area. Just these seed flats are really easy to use. You can use the bottom as a reservoir for water to make watering really easy. And there are all sorts of different commercial growing mixes that you can use that are soil-less mixes. So that's going to mean that they're sterile. You're not going to have any worries about plant disease getting in there, like some of the root diseases that we suffer through. And it's going to really make starting off those seeds really easy. So those are going to be high peat products usually. Several companies make little tablets that you expand with water in order to make the whole process very, very simple. But any potting media will do just fine. Just make some shallow indentations in that after you fill the flat with soil and sow the seeds in there. Don't worry if you get more than one seed in a container. A lot of our herbs have very small seeds, and it can be difficult to get one seed in there. We can always thin later. And some of the herbs, if they have larger seeds, you're going to want to, get those down into the soil about twice their diameter. On the seed packet you have, there should be directions for what soil depth to plant them at. If they have very small seeds, you can just put them right across the top. And what I do rather than pressing them in is when I fill the flats with soil, I leave a little bit of headspace at the top. And I'll just sprinkle soil lightly over the top of the seeds. And that just kind of makes sure that they're covered, but they're not covered too heavily. If the temperatures are a little cool, you can, some of the seed flats will come with a little plastic cover, or you can just get a big plastic bag, a clear plastic bag, and cover that flat or kind of, seal it in. And that's going to create a little greenhouse effect that's going to warm up that soil and improve your germination. Of course, if you're starting seed right now, which some of us are, low temperatures are the least of our worries, and the seed should germinate just fine without that. Now, one quick note on the seed flats and trays and things like that. They're absolutely reusable. So if you've purchased transplants, you're going to start seeds later. It's useful to just take those. You can clean them out, put them in the sun where they're, going to, anything that might be on them is taken care of, and you can reuse those years to years. So we're not throwing that plastic away. Now, keep them good and evenly watered. And then just you'll want to transplant those herbs when the seedlings have 2 or 3 of their true leaves. So they'll come up. The first leaves you'll see will be the cotyledon leaves, and then they'll put up their true leaves that usually have a different shape. Once they have about 3 of those, we can get those transplanted out into the garden. Now, it is a good idea if we're in the spring to harden off the transplants. So during the day, when it's a little bit warmer, you can put them out in their seed flat or in a pot outside in an area that's going to have light shade, and that's just going to help adapt them to the outside environment and help reduce transplant shock a little bit. Now, often we do find ourselves buying transplants. So I am going to make some comments that apply not only to our herbs, but also to any plant that you're purchasing as a transplant. So all of your vegetables as well. You're going to find a wide array of different herbs at the garden stores. Make sure you're selecting healthy plants. You don't see any sign that they've been underwatered. They don't have yellowing leaves and they're not drooping. Ideally, you want to check their root system. Don't be shy. Just be gentle with them and kind of check and make sure that they haven't gotten root bound while they've been sitting there. The roots should be a nice white or greenish white color. You see really darkened roots, that can be a sign that they have a disease, and you don't want to do that. And when we're planting those transplants out in the garden, make sure that we put them in at the same height as we have them in that container that they came in, because planting them too deep can cause the roots to rot or cause rots around the base of that plant. Now, there are quite a few of our herbs that can be propagated by cuttings. So in spring or in summer, we want to cut about 3 to 5 inches of new growth that it's going to contain 2 or more nodes on that plant. You can see an example of that with rosemary. Just make that cut right below a node where the leaf joins to the stem. Remove those lower leaves. Use some rooting hormone, dip it in there. You can set those right into the soil. Keep them misted if you can. Try to keep them in a high humidity area. Make sure that you keep them well watered, and you should see root development on that relatively quickly. It's also certainly possible to just put them in water, and you can actually watch the roots being formed, which is a great thing to do, just kind of as an entertaining thing, and it's certainly a great thing to do if you have some young people around, because you can show them the growth of those roots. Again, make sure we keep that medium, whatever they're in, warm. We don't want it to get too cold, and we should have roots on those plants anywhere between 3 to 6 weeks. And that's going to vary by the species or the type of herb that we're dealing with, as well as temperature and a few other factors. There are some herbs, particularly French tarragon, is really only propagated by cuttings. So it's a useful thing to know if you're growing that particular herb. There are some other herbs that we can separate by divisions and by layering. Particularly herbs that form clumps with a whole lot, with many fibrous roots. The example that I'll start with would be like lemongrass, but certainly mint will be another example of a plant that we can divide very easily. So we just want to slice through a section of it with a shovel or dig up the entire plant, split that, and then we just replant those divisions. Make sure we water them really well. Make sure we have good root and soil contact with that water. And generally speaking, at these plants that we're dividing will actually benefit from this. They need to be thinned down so that they're actively growing. And so we can divide them every few years. And if you don't have anywhere in your landscape to take those divisions, then it's always something that you can share with friends and family members, and they can enjoy them. You can propagate some herbs just by simple layering, where you bend a branch down, cover it with some soil, leave it there, and it will start to produce roots. And you can see a more in-depth discussion of that in the previous video that we've done that specifically talked about plant propagation. And layering, generally speaking, is something you're going to want to do in the spring and in the summer. And I've just included this slide because it lists a lot of the different herbs that we're likely to run into and talks about their common methods of propagation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but you can see the herb types that we commonly will produce from seed. Of course, basil and cilantro and parsley, marjoram, thyme, fennel, really common herbs. But then we have some of our perennial herbs. Bay certainly stands out, and rosemary that we tend to reproduce by cuttings. And then plants like mint or sorrel or chives that we can divide and spread those out in the landscape. So a lot of our herbs do have very tender growth, and it's important that we prune those, particularly if we have plants that are going year to year. Any dead tissue we have in the spring needs to be removed before it starts to grow. And if we are growing things like basil, where we really want that young foliage, it's a good idea to prune them regularly throughout the growing season because that's going to encourage fresh and young growth. And what you want to do is just snip them right above a node on that plant. And that's going to encourage them to be really bushy and to produce a lot of young growth. Now, when we harvest is going to be really important as well. That pruning proper time is really going to depend on the type of plant we have. And harvesting is going to be best done in the early morning, right after the dew is dried. That's where we're going to get the sort of the maximum benefit out of that plant. If we're growing herbs for their foliage, again, basil is going to be my classic example. We want to harvest those ideally before they flower because flowering can cause the foliage to develop kind of an off flavor and will also result in the plant just not growing quite as vigorously. If we're collecting the flowers, things like borage or chamomile, we want to collect those just before full flower. And if they're growing for seed, we just want to wait for those seed pods to change color from green or brown to gray. And before they start to shatter and open, because we want to actually catch the seeds. There aren't a lot of examples of herb roots. Ginseng would be one example. But for that, you're going to collect that in the fall after the foliage has already faded back. You do want to make sure when you're harvesting plants for foliage that you leave enough for the plant to maintain growth. Oftentimes with herbs, you can take up to 75% of the season's current growth and still retain enough of that plant to be healthy. For annual herbs, you're going to be able to keep harvesting those until frost because you're not worried about whether they're going to make it through the winter. Perennial herbs, you want to kind of stop when we get to late August because we want to make sure that we're not getting new tender growth. It's not going to be able to harden off before winter comes around. If you have tarragon or lavender, harvest those in early summer and then shear the plants back to about half their height. And that's going to encourage a second flowering period in the fall before winter comes along. All right, so now I'm going to run through some of the really common herbs that we grow here in Mississippi. This is by no stretch of the imagination a complete list, but it's certainly some of the common ones. I'm just going to make some small notes about each of them. Basil is a wonderful herb to grow. It goes really well in all sorts of different dishes that we can make in the home. So pestos and tomato sauces and all sorts of great stuff like that. Basil is fantastically easy to grow from seed. If we do plant it in rows, you want to keep about 12 inches between plants. That's just going to give it enough space to really get up to the size that we want it at. And basil needs to be pruned throughout the growing season, again, to really get that bushy growth. Again, basil has a massive tendency to flower. So flowering is going to give you a little bit of a bitter flavor on the leaves. So I always remove those flower stalks as soon as I start to see them, and that kind of trains the plant back into producing that vegetative growth. We can pick basil leaves about 6 weeks after we have planted, and again, just cut just above a pair of leaves if we're harvesting that whole stem, because that's going to produce that bushy growth. Um, if you have leaves that we're going to produce for drying, of course, Jennifer is going to speak more about that. Just cut those right before the flowers open. And there are a lot of different kinds of basil. So sweet basil is what we normally think of, but you can also find spicy globe basil. It has a little bit more of a compact plant size. Lemon basil has a really distinct lemon fragrance to it and a slightly different taste. Cinnamon basil has really nice dark green shiny leaves that really make it attractive as an ornamental plant in addition to as an herb. And then Thai basil has a fairly distinctive taste and appearance, really very decorative with purple stems and purple flowers. It's used a lot in Asian cooking. Is really tasty, but also a wonderful ornamental plant. Rosemary, a wonderful plant for the home landscape for a variety of reasons. Certainly a very tough plant. It's hardy and evergreen, so those plants can last for years and get to pretty significant size. Have a really nice resinous fragrance to them that you'll smell every time you brush past them. I keep some by my front door just to have that right at the entrance to the house. They do really prefer well-drained soils. One of the most frequent problems that I see with rosemary is overwatering. They do like that full sun, and they're relatively easy to propagate and share around to your friends just by making cuttings. You can purchase rosemary seed. My experience with that has not been great in terms of the germination rate that I've gotten for rosemary. It's a little bit slow trying to produce them from seed, but cuttings work fantastically well. You can direct their growth a little bit just by a little bit of pruning and shape them how you would like them to be, because they can get up to 6 feet tall. There are some prostrate forms of rosemary, so you can get the varieties that kind of hang down over the side of a landscape feature or over the side of a pot. You can use them the exact same way as you would use traditional rosemary, but they work just fine. And again, as an ornamental plant, when they flower, the flowers are those really gorgeous blue flowers. So they make a nice ornamental as well as a plant that deer do not like. So for those of you trying to deal with wildlife, rosemary is a good option. Thyme is another perennial herb. Oftentimes I tend to treat it as an annual, but it will last from year to year. Stays about 10 inches in height at a maximum. Really nice sort of lilac or light purple flowers in clusters, and works very well because of that as an edging plant around other features in the landscape. Prefers those same well-drained soils, and will last year to year. So you will need to kind of to thin it or renew it every few years. You can propagate that by cuttings, by division. You can plant seed, and works very well. Just cut the leafy tops and the flower clusters when you first start to see blossoms. You can dry those. There are, again, several different kinds of thyme. There's English thyme and French thyme and German thyme that have a little bit of variation in their flavor and in their leaf shape. In my experience, it hasn't been particularly noticeable in terms of flavor. You'll also see lemon thyme, and there is a sort of creeping ornamental variety of thyme called mother of thyme that works really well in the landscape. Oregano, which I don't know who calls it wild marjoram, but that's just another name for it. Another perennial, gets up to about 2 feet in height. really grows well. If you have an area where you just have poor soil, it'll still do okay. You can get it to grow a little bit more by cutting the flowers back. And you will want to replant and just kind of replace it when the plants get really woody. A lot of these perennial herbs tend to get woody stems. They stop producing as much foliage. And when that happens, you just kind of need to renew what's going on in order to really have that nice herbaceous growth. There is sweet marjoram or just marjoram to distinguish it from wild marjoram or oregano. Really low growth habit, looks fairly similar to oregano, though its flowers look quite different. Usually we grow this as an annual, so it's not going to last from year to year, but it is relatively easy to grow from seed. And you just want to cut the stems at flowering, and they dry well for future use. We talked a little bit about tarragon, French tarragon, because we talked about it needing to be produced from cuttings. You can use division as well. Has a really nice multi-branch growth, gets up to about 2 foot tall. And you just want to use the fresh young leaves and stem tips. Tarragon, unfortunately, doesn't dry well, so you need to keep some fresh plants around if you're going to use this herb. Take those cuttings as soon as you can before when it's time to use them. Everybody knows sage, another nice perennial that, like the other perennials, again, it will get woody over time. Has really nice, kind of really attractive, if you ask me, kind of grayish green leaves. Though there are some variegated varieties that provide a little bit of interest in color. Year to year, just take away any dead or woody stems, but leave that new growth. Pick the leaves and use them fresh, or they can be dried fairly easily. Do have a couple of questions there that I want to go ahead and address before we move on. If your rosemary leaf tips are turning black, particularly if they're in a pot, the first thing I'm going to check is watering, because that tends to be the most common issue. You can get some insects on them, like aphids and things like that. They're not really common, so watering is going to be your most common reason. And tarragon will tolerate sunny conditions, so you should be fine in that regard. All right, cilantro and coriander. They're both the same things. We call it cilantro when we harvest the leaves, and we call it coriander when we harvest the seed. It's annual, grows up to about 2 feet. Going to produce that from seed each year. And if we leave those seed in there, it will reseed, and we will start seeing it produce back, from year to year. One of the big problems we have with cilantro, particularly if we're trying to use the leaves, is that when it's, particularly when we have warm weather, it has a nasty tendency to bolt and start to produce seed, and so the leaves become distasteful, which is great if we want coriander and not so great if we want the leaves. I often plant it in the fall as a way to collect the leaves, but planting it in succession, where we're planting it every few weeks, allows us to kind of keep that growth really active, produce a lot of leaves that are going to be useful in the kitchen. Another very common herb that we use is parsley. Parsley, of course, is very commonly used in cooking, lots of different soups. It is a biennial, so normally it would grow in 1 year and flower in the next, but we pretty commonly just treat it as an annual and start it from seed in the spring. It is slow to germinate, so we do have to be patient with it. And we just use it for leaves. We cut the leaves when they're of a suitable size. There are two very common varieties of parsley that we will see. The first of those is flat leaf parsley, and I would recommend that you use flat leaf parsley in cooking. Curly leaf parsley has a little bit less flavor to it and is really just better used as a garnish. Dill is one of my favorite herbs. I like pickles and I like Greek food, so I grow a lot of dill. Has really nice, finely divided yellow leaves, really nice purple flowers as well. Bees absolutely love dill, so it's a great addition to the landscape to support bees. And it is relatively easy to grow from seed. And if anyone needs any, let me know. I accidentally ordered a pound of dill seed rather than an ounce, so I do have quite a bit laying around. Can be difficult to transplant, so I really suggest that we direct seed that. And it does grow a bit tall, so occasionally we'll have it kind of flop over, so you may want to stake it. If you leave it in the garden, the seeds will drop to the ground and it will self-seed. You can pick the leaves just as the flowers open. Really wonderful in a lot of different foods. And of course, we can collect those seeds by letting those seeds mature on the plant. When they turn flat and brown, we can harvest those. What I do is I put a bag over the top of the seed head and just shake the bag, and that allows me to collect all of those mature seeds. Dill does fantastic. We can start that in the spring, and in response to a question, start that in the spring. But I've just started some again to grow some more dill as we get towards the fall. Dill really isn't a perennial; it's more of an annual. And so while it reseeds, it's going to produce those seeds. They're going to fall to the ground. So you may see the dill come back, but it's not generally treated as a perennial. Kind of very similar in appearance. There's caraway. It's a biennial plant, gets up to about 30 inches in height. You can always tell it apart because dill tends to have yellow flowers and caraway will tend to have white clusters of flowers, but they both have fairly similar growth habits. Really easy to put in from seed, but often the plants aren't going to produce those seed in the first year. If you plant them in the fall, they will bear seed in the following year. Again, a little bit better to put those in direct seeded rather than from transplants. Put in extra seed and thin them down. Mulch them well in the winter to protect them from the cold. And then when the seeds are mature, again, you can just use that same method of sticking a bag over it and shaking it to easily collect those seeds. Chives are another personal favorite. They kind of have a really nice, subtle onion type flavor. Kind of a interesting round leaf. You start them easily from seed. You can grow them from transplants. They like full sun and well-drained soil. They do really produce those. I love the flowers that form on chives. I think they're really attractive. So I like to include them as part of ornamental plantings as well. And you can just take those flowers and they're edible. You can put them in salads as well as put them in flower arrangements. And they have a really nice subtle flavor to them. You can divide clumps of chives. They'll last for years. Just divide those clumps and thin them a little bit. And you can expand where they are in the garden. You will see garlic chives. They are actually a different species. You can always tell the difference between regular chives and garlic chives because garlic chives have a flat leaf and white flowers, tend to bloom later in the season, but we use them much the same way. Fennel, very similar. Fennel is another plant where we kind of have two different kinds of fennel. It is a perennial, though we do generally grow it as an annual. It will get up to about 3 or 4 feet in height. really finely divided leaves that are kind of thin thread-like segments. Really easy to grow from seed in the spring out in the full sun. So the two different kinds of fennel, we use fennel as an herb where we're using the leaves, but we can also eat the bulb of fennel. And so the bulb is a slightly different variety that tends to grow shorter and have a darker foliage, and it just produces a little bit thicker of a stem there that makes it more useful for a vegetable as opposed to an herb. A little bit less common, but an herb that's relatively easy to grow is sorrel. It grows as a rosette, has those interesting sort of lance-shaped leaves. I still think they work very good decoratively because of that interesting sort of red color that you get on the veins in the leaf. Sow those seeds about an inch deep. Really likes full sun, rich, moist soil. You can remove any seed stalks as they appear to keep those leaves producing, and divide them every 3 to 4 years, and spread that sorrel however much you would like. And just collect the leaves as you would need to. They have, in the early spring, they're going to have a really mild taste. As we move into the summer, they're going to have a lot more of an acidic taste to them. One thing to mention about sorrel is that it contains oxalic acid. And so there's some health problems where we really do need to minimize the amount of oxalic acid we're taking in. So if you have one of those health conditions, just keep in mind that you may want to avoid this. And sorrel is really interesting. It has so much going on. You can actually stain some pans when you're cooking sorrel from the strength of the chemicals that are in it. All right. Mint is really popular. It is a perennial, really easy to start from cuttings and really easy to divide. Will produce about 2 or more feet in height. Does I say that it grows best in rich and moist soils, but as of yet, I have not found a soil that it doesn't grow well in. Sun or shade doesn't seem to matter. My warning about mint is that mint can kind of be a bully and spread a little bit too aggressively in the landscape. So my recommendation is to plant it in a container. If you really want it to look like it's in the ground, just bury the container with about an inch of it showing above the soil line. And anytime the mint tries to spread beyond that point, cut it back. The more frequently you cut it, the more it will grow. And there are, of course, many different kinds of mint with slight differences in their flavor. So I grow several different kinds just to kind of enjoy the different tastes that they can have. One of my favorite herbs is lemongrass. I just love the lemon scent of it. Grows about 4 feet tall. It does have that grassy growth. And we're cutting that lower end on the stem that's used in teas or used in Southeastern Asian cuisine. I am particularly fond of Thai food, and lemongrass is a component of that. You want to harvest the stalks once the plant reaches about 12 inches tall, and those stalks are about a ½ inch wide at the base. Really likes full sun. You can give it a little bit of shade, and you can separate this. You can use divisions, and it will work just fine, just like you would separate any clumping grass. Very different than many of the other plants that we're talking about. Bay is a small evergreen tree. Often we do grow them in containers because the young ones may not thrive in native soil, but they can take temperatures down to freezing or past it rather at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Really likes full sun, moist soil. We can use those leaves fresh just as much as we do dried. and we often grow them from cuttings or from air layers. And they take being pruned very well, so we can topiary them and get all sorts of fantastic shapes. Just have a couple of more notes, very frequent questions for people growing herbs. Bolting is a common issue, and that's just the plant going to flowers, going to seed prematurely, usually because the temperature is varied. So we get warm days following cold days. Cilantro is particularly prone to that. Um, and basil is very prone to that. So pinching off those flowers as soon as they appear will prolong production and keep allow you to keep harvesting the leaves. I want to go back and answer a question about bay because you get asked questions. Can different kinds of bay trees be different things get called bay trees? You really want to make sure that what you have is the bay laurel. That is the bay tree. I wouldn't advise using anything else besides that as an element in your cooking. It is a different tree, and so, for example, we may talk about sweet bay magnolias, but what we want to use is the bay laurel or Laurelus nobilis. Another really common thing that happens for herbs is overwatering, um, and that really is just kind of making sure that we're restraining ourselves when we have plants in containers. The overwatering kind of starves the roots of oxygen, and you'll start to see yellowing, particularly at the bottom leaves and the inner leaves. And that's just a really good sign that we might need to back up on our water a little bit. And remember, we don't want to overwater, we don't want to over fertilize because we want that really good, strong taste out of those herbs. And so I'm not going to go into the detail on this. I wanted to include this chart as something that you'll see in the file if you download that. But just a quick little reference chart that I pulled up on different herbs and their spacing and when we would expect them to flower. So I'm not going to go into that, but you will be able to get this in the file that you can download off of the internet. All right, so with that, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to go ahead and stop my sharing, and I am going to turn things over to my coworker, Miss Jennifer O'Banner, who is going to talk a little bit about using herbs and preserving them. So thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Christian. As Christian stated, I am Jennifer O'Banner, his colleague here in Hancock County Extension, and I'm going to go over just a few things concerning the preservation of herbs. It's extremely simple, way more easy than those canned goods. So hopefully I can get my screen shared properly. All right, and there we are. So starting off, vinegars and oils. I actually enjoy talking about this one because I myself, when I was younger, when you first get off to college and you start cooking and stuff on your own without your mom's help, you start to experiment a little. And I thought I would experiment with some olive oil and some garlic. And thank God I was in a dietetic program and learned that that was not the thing to do, at least for shelf life, leaving it in the cabinet. So if you are interested in seasoning your own oils or vinegars, only for 4 days in the refrigerator. Try to use them by then. If not, you have to discard them. And the reason being is the exact same problem that we can see in canned goods, and that is the wonderful bacteria Clostridium botulinum, which produces botulism, is what we call it. And we're familiar with lockjaw when, of course, there is the potential of death. So if you're going to try to season your own oils or vinegars, please abstain from keeping them out on the counter or even in a cabinet. Put them in the refrigerator. Again, you want to use them within 4 days. And there is a difference between those that are homemade and those that are store-bought. Now, if you're buying an infused oil or vinegar from the store, it's because they have taken the proper protocols so that you won't have to worry about the Clostridium botulinum. And trust me, they don't want a lawsuit, so they are safe. Whereas the ones that you make at home, if you're not going to go through any processing, proper processing with heat, then you should not be making it for long-term use. So we're going to move on. And here, this is one of my absolute favorites. I love making teas at home. We can, as Christian stated earlier, with herbs, that goes from your bark, your flower, the leaves, and some roots. They are considered herbs. So we have a tendency to make herbal teas from like homemade. You can order your own bags, or you can use reusable tea holders that are oftentimes made from metal, and you can just make your own tea at home. But if you are going to make your own herbal teas, you have to worry about bacteria growth. So with that being said, it's good to have that kettle where you're bringing that water to a boil, because to limit bacteria production and causing you harm from a foodborne illness, that temperature has to be between 180 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And you have to let it boil for 5 to 15 minutes to ensure that those bacteria are being destroyed, because you don't want those problems. Who wants to food poison themselves? I certainly don't. Okay, so forms of preserving our herbs. We have the food dehydrator, microwave oven, air drying, even with the oven. And I'm going to touch on these very briefly. Now, when it comes to the food dehydrator, which is extremely convenient, this may be one of the easiest methods in my opinion. You just simply follow the owner's manual. They'll typically have directions for anything that you're going to be using. So that's what you'll do. Just refer to the owner's manual with a food dehydrator. Now, a microwave oven, on the other hand, this one can be a little challenging because there is the risk of burning your herbs. And who wants to burn their herbs, man? It's like your produce, you reaped your harvest, and then you accidentally burn them. And that is definitely something that I would do. So I would not use this method. But the first thing you want to do is make sure those herbs are dry. And the easiest way to do that is just, depending on which herbs you're going to be drying. Let's just say I have some rosemary. I'm going to put a couple, 2-3 twigs within between 2 paper towels and pat them as much as I can to get them as dry as I can. And once you do that, you'll lay them in the microwave, cooking them with 30-second intervals. Now, you may want to go down to 15-second intervals because, like I said, it's so easy when we put things in the microwave to just walk away because it's cooking on its own terms. But these things are likely to burn. They will dry very quickly. So there's that risk. You even have a risk of a fire if they get too dry. And once you remove them from the microwave, try to avoid crushing the leaves. And the reason why we want to do that is because once we start crushing those leaves, the oils we're letting out the oils and the flavor. And you want to try to preserve that flavor until you're ready to cook with them, until you're ready to use them for whatever dish you're going to be using them for. But we're going to store them in a cool, dry area. Emphasis on dry, because if they're in an area where they will obtain moisture, you have to worry about bacteria growth. So again, make sure you're drying them and placing them in an area that is also dry. And there is the air drying method. And this one is extremely cost effective because it's air drying. It doesn't require any energy. So it's just letting God do what he does and allow the plants to dry. But there is a risk for contamination because it is air drying and there could be mold growth. So that is one of the I would say downfalls to letting our herbs air dry. And here you see you want to avoid this method on tender leaf herbs, and Christian touched briefly on that earlier. That's your tarragon, your basil, and your mint. And the method that you're going to air dry, and note that you're going to tie at least 2 or 3 twigs together. Not 5, 10 of them, because if you tie a lot of them together, that moisture is going to be trapped. And you want to avoid the trapping of moisture, because if you don't, then you're having the perfect environment for bacteria growth, for mold growth, especially if we're going to place it in an area where it can dry, where it's not cold and it's not hot. It's just the perfect environment for mold growth. So make sure you're only tying 2 or 3 twigs by the stem, and you're going to hang these, or you can use a cheesecloth, or another great method is just lying it down on a screen, and it's called a drying tray. And that way you're allowing the air to flow so that you're not having to deal with that moisture, which is again a breeding ground for bacteria. Okay, and you want to avoid direct sunlight. And here we are, the tray drying, which is pretty much exactly like the air drying method. You can make these at home or you can purchase them. And that's a cool summer project. If you're looking for something for the kids to do right now, this would be a pretty cool project. What you'll do is just spread those herbs on your tray, and you're gonna do a single layer because again, you want them to dry thoroughly, because if you don't, bacteria. I know you're like, dang, she really stresses that bacteria. And the reason I do is because you often see people who will not spread them out across so that they are getting enough air to dry out, and they end up losing all of their products. So I want you to avoid loss, especially if it's your time and your energy that you're putting into this. And with this method, the only extra step that you see is you may have to flip the leaves over to make sure that they are dried thoroughly. But other than that, it does the work itself. Literally, you don't have to do anything. All right, so here we also have oven drying as a way to preserve and dry your herbs. But this one is somewhat difficult, especially with ovens that have a mind of their own. And if you bake cakes, you know exactly what I mean. So you're trying to get between 90 and 110 degrees. If you're under it, it's going to take longer. If you're over it, you're risking burning your herbs up. And again, you want to have a single layer. You're not trying to put them on top of each other just because you're running out of time or you have a certain time you want to have them finished. You do not want to just pile them all on top of one another. You want a single layer. And the only bad part about this is the energy. You're talking about 3 to 4 hours in your oven. So that's one, it's not as cost effective. However, it is a method that you can use to dry your herbs. And storing the herbs, even for the herbs that you're buying out of the grocery store. I know it's cool to put them in jars that look really nice so everyone can see them. So you're thinking, I'm gonna store them on my countertop where the sun is shining directly on them. Please do not do this. Make sure you're storing them in a well shaded area in a cabinet is what I would encourage. And even have them in dark glass, dark containers, even a ceramic jar. And make sure that that jar is airtight, because there are some cute jars that we may come across, but they're not airtight. So you're risking them having a reduced quality over a short period of time. And again, you're not getting that bang for your buck. You're losing quality, and I'm trying to help you avoid that. And again, you want to avoid them being crushed. You want to try to wait until the time comes when you're ready to use them in your preparation for a meal, and label your containers. Some of these herbs resemble each other a lot, and it will be horrible to be preparing a meal and put the wrong herb in your meal. I'm sure we've all done it before. I have, and you don't get the desired flavor you're looking for. So make sure you're labeling those containers. And of course, you want to make sure they're maintaining that high quality, the highest quality possible. And the way we're going to do that, I'm going to repeat this again. Ensure that they're dry. Ensure that you're using an airtight container and placing them in a cool and dry place. Okay? All right. And they can maintain high quality for up to a year. Now, my herbs don't tend to last an entire year. However, you have a shelf life of at least 1 year if you dry them properly. You can always judge the quality of your product by the smell of them. If you open it up and you smell nothing at all, chances are it's not going to taste like anything. But if you open up your container and there's still this wonderful aroma, I love oregano and basil. Those are two of my favorites. And when I open up my container, I want to smell that wonderful aroma. But if I don't smell it, chances are my herbs are not going to be good. It'll be just like adding bland grass to your dish. And that's all I have, Kristen. And thank you so much for allowing me to join you today. And if you have any questions, I am